Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the law they never wanted you to know.
I was a child when they came, the Emperor's angels, descending from the ash-grey sky in drop pods that struck the earth like the fists of an angry god, and I remember thinking in that moment before everything changed forever that they were beautiful, these armored giants whose presence made the air itself seem to vibrate with suppressed violence and holy purpose. I lived on an agri world whose name you wouldn't recognize because it no longer exists, not even as a cinder floating in the void, and my life before their arrival was simple in the way that billions of imperial citizens experience simplicity: work the fields, pay the tithes, attend the prayer sessions in the chapel where the preacher spoke of the emperor's love in terms that always sounded more like threats than promises. The soil of that world was black and rich, generations of careful cultivation producing yields that fed 3 neighboring systems, and we took pride in that contribution, even as we resented the quotas that left us perpetually on the edge of starvation, even as we buried children who died from malnutrition-related diseases, while our grain was loaded onto transport ships bound for worlds we would never see. But pride and resentment were luxuries we couldn't afford to examine too closely, so we worked, and we prayed, and we pretended that the Imperium's machinery functioned with a logic that justified our suffering. The Space Marines established their command post in the Governor's Palace, requisitioned it without consultation or compensation, and within hours the building had been transformed into a fortress, its decorative architecture covered with armor, plating, and weapon emplacements, its gardens paved over to create landing pads for the Thunderhawks that shuttled between the surface and the battle barge in orbit. I saw them only from a distance in those first days, massive figures in power armor decorated with purity seals and devotional script, moving with a purposefulness that made ordinary human activity seem aimless by comparison. They were here because of the murders, the 17 settlers found in the western fields, with their bodies arranged in patterns that the local Arbites couldn't explain and that suggested ritual rather than conventional violence, and the Space Marines had been dispatched to investigate because the patterns matched something in their archives, some threat that required their particular expertise to identify and neutralize. The fields where the bodies were found had been burned by order of the Arbites, the soil sterilized and the crops destroyed, and we'd lost a week's worth of production, which meant the tithe quota would be harder to meet, which meant someone would pay with their rations or their freedom or their life. Because in the Imperium's accounting system, every deficit requires a corresponding sacrifice. My father worked as a field supervisor, overseeing 200 laborers who planted and harvested according to schedules calculated on Holy Terror and transmitted to our world through the Administratum's vast bureaucratic machinery, and he was required to attend the briefings that the Space Marines conducted for the civilian leadership, meetings where information flowed only one direction, and questions were discouraged through the simple expedient of ignoring them. He came home from the first briefing with his face pale and his hands shaking, and when my mother asked what he'd learned, he said nothing for a long time, just sat at our small table staring at his clasped fingers, and finally he said that there were things on our world that shouldn't be there, things that had been growing in the dark places between the fields, things that the murders had revealed through their particular obscenity. He wouldn't elaborate, said that elaboration would be heresy, that even acknowledging what he'd seen in the briefing materials was dangerous, and he made us all kneel and pray for an hour, reciting the Imperial Creed until our knees ached and our voices grew hoarse, as if sufficient devotion could insulate us from whatever contamination had taken root in our world's soil. The investigation proceeded with methodical brutality, the Space Marines and their accompanying inquisitorial agents moving through the settlements and questioning everyone, using methods that ranged from conventional interrogation to more invasive techniques involving psychic probing and chemical enhancement, and people emerged from those sessions changed, their eyes distant and their speech hesitant, as if they'd seen things that their minds couldn't fully process, and were struggling to construct narratives that would allow them to continue functioning. 3 people disappeared entirely, taken away in sealed transports to destinations unknown, and their families were relocated to different settlements, as if proximity to the disappeared might itself be contagious. The Space Marines burned more fields, entire sections of cultivation reduced to ash based on criteria they didn't share with the civilian population, and the smoke from those fires hung over the settlements for days, acrid and chemical smelling, carrying particles that made our eyes water and our throats burn, and that left a taste like copper on our tongues. The tithe quota was adjusted downward, a rare concession that should have brought relief, but that instead amplified our anxiety because it meant the situation was serious enough that even the administratum's inflexible demands could be superseded by whatever threat the Space Marines were hunting. The children started having nightmares in the third week, all of them simultaneously, hundreds of young voices crying out in the night with terror that couldn't be soothed by parental comfort or by the chaplains who moved through the settlements, attempting to provide spiritual guidance. My younger sister woke screaming about something she called the Smiling Man, a figure who appeared in her dreams and showed her things that made her cry, even in recollection, and when my parents pressed her for details, she could only describe images that made no sense, gardens that grew downward into darkness instead of upward toward light, stars that bled, colors that had no names, people whose skin had become transparent, revealing organs that pulsed with their own luminescence. The other children reported similar visions, variations on themes of wrongness and inversion and revelation of things that should remain hidden, and the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, too coordinated to be natural childhood imagination. The inquisitorial agents questioned the children, subjected them to the same invasive procedures they'd used on the adults, and several children didn't survive those sessions, their minds apparently too fragile to withstand whatever psychic probing was being conducted, and their bodies were returned to their families with instructions to cremate them immediately and to speak of them never again. The first open manifestation occurred during a prayer assembly, when Preacher Voss was midway through his weekly sermon about the Emperor's infinite mercy and the congregation's infinite debt, and the air in the chapel began to shimmer like heat distortion, except the temperature was dropping rather than rising. And through that shimmer we saw things moving, shapes that approximated human forms, but that were wrong in every detail, proportions that violated aesthetic intuition, movements that seemed to occur between rather than during moments, faces that were simultaneously too specific and too generic to pass as actual features. Preacher Voss stopped speaking mid-sentence, his mouth remaining open as if the words had simply ceased to exist, and he began to change, his skin rippling and his bones shifting beneath the surface like something was reconfiguring him from within, and the congregation scattered in panic, pushing toward the exits, while the Space Marines who'd been standing guard at the chapel's entrance moved forward with bolters raised, and the sound of their weapons firing in the enclosed space was deafening, was physically painful, and the rounds that hit Preacher Voss exploded his body into fragments that didn't bleed red, but instead leaked something iridescent that spread across the chapel floor and released vapors that smelled like burned sugar and rotten flowers. The evacuation order came that night, broadcast through every Vox speaker and announced by servitors that moved through the streets with recorded messages playing on infinite loop, and we were given 6 hours to gather what we could carry and report to the designated assembly points for transport off-world. The announcement provided no explanation, no context beyond the flat statement that the planetary governor had requested immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel in consultation with the Space Marine commander, and that compliance was mandatory under Imperial law, and that anyone who failed to report to the assembly points would be considered in violation of direct orders and subject to summary execution. 6 hours to abandon a world, to pack the accumulated possessions of generations into whatever bags and cases we could find, to say goodbye to homes and gardens and the graves of our ancestors who'd worked this soil for centuries, and the impossibility of the task meant that most people simply gave up, brought nothing beyond the clothes they wore, and perhaps a single treasured object small enough to carry in pocket or hand. My father brought his prayer book, the one his father had given him, and my mother brought her wedding ring, though she had to wear it because we had no safe place to store it, and I brought nothing because nothing seemed worth preserving, because the world itself had become the thing being left behind, and individual possessions were just fragments of a larger loss that no amount of sentimentality could mitigate. The transports were grain haulers, the same ships that normally carried our tithes off-world, retrofitted with minimal life support and no amenities beyond the bare necessities of keeping human cargo alive for the duration of the journey, and they packed us in with density that would have been illegal for livestock, thousands of people per hold standing pressed together in darkness, broken only by emergency lumen strips that cast everything in shades of red. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. The concentrated stench of human fear, sweat and breath, and the waste that people couldn't hold because there were no facilities and nowhere to go, even if there had been, and we stood there in the dark and the stink and the heat generated by too many bodies in too small a space, and we didn't speak because speaking would have required acknowledging what was happening, would have required processing the reality that we'd been deemed expendable enough to be removed, but not valuable enough to be removed with dignity. The ship's engines created vibration that traveled through the deck plating and into our bones, and some people vomited from the nausea that the vibration induced, and the vomit had nowhere to go except down onto the deck where it mixed with the other fluids that were accumulating, and we stood in that mixture because standing required less energy than trying to move, and energy was a resource we were conserving because the journey would take weeks, and the rations we'd been given were calculated for survival rather than comfort. I don't know how many people died during the transit, but I know there were bodies when we finally arrived at the refugee processing station, corpses that had remained standing because the press of living bodies around them prevented them from falling, and it was only when the holds were emptied and we emerged into the harsh light of the station's cargo bays that the dead toppled, and we could see how many had failed to survive the journey. The station personnel dealt with the bodies efficiently, loaded them onto trolleys and wheeled them away to wherever such things were processed, and they gave us no time to mourn or even to identify who had died, just pushed us forward through processing lines, where we were scanned and logged and assigned new identification codes that replaced our names, because names were apparently too complex for the systems that tracked refugee populations. I became a string of numbers and letters, a designation that encoded my world of origin and my age and my occupational category and nothing about who I actually was, and when I tried to tell the processing clerk that I had a name, that I was a person with identity beyond the categories in her cogitator, she looked at me with the kind of exhausted pity that said she'd heard this complaint 10,000 times before and that it changed nothing, that the system processed categories, not individuals, and that my insistence on personhood was touching but irrelevant to the logistics of managing millions of displaced people. The refugee camp where they housed us was a converted manufactorum, a massive structure that had once produced some component for some machine, but that had been repurposed when the production was relocated elsewhere, and now it held row after row of sleeping mats, separated by fabric partitions that provided the illusion of privacy without the reality, and the air tasted of industrial chemicals that no amount of environmental processing could fully remove. We lived there for months, waiting for permanent relocation assignments that came through the same opaque bureaucratic processes that governed everything in the Imperium, and during those months we heard nothing official about what had happened to our world, received no explanation for why we'd been evacuated, were given no information about whether we would ever return or whether return was even possible. But information circulated anyway, passed through whisper networks and trading of rumors, and the stories that came back said that the contamination on our world had been worse than initially assessed, that the investigation had revealed corruption running through the entire ecosystem, that the thing that had killed the 17 settlers and that had manifested in the chapel had been symptom rather than cause, evidence of deeper rot that had spread too far to be excised without destroying the patient. The word Exterminatus filtered through the camp like a disease, spoken in whispers and denied in official channels, but the word persisted because it explained what nothing else could explain, why an entire world's population had been evacuated with such urgency, why we were being told that return was impossible, why the camp administrators avoided questions about our home with expressions that mixed bureaucratic irritation with something that looked almost like guilt. Exterminatus, the ultimate sanction. The declaration that a world was so compromised that its only possible fate was complete annihilation. Every living thing sterilized, every structure reduced to molten slag, the entire planet rendered lifeless and left as a monument to the price of failure. The word came from High Gothic and meant roughly being destroyed utterly. And it was a word that appeared in imperial doctrine as both warning and promise, as the stick that enforced compliance with regulations designed to prevent exactly the kind of contamination that had apparently consumed our world. I didn't want to believe it. Couldn't reconcile the black soil and golden grain I'd known my entire life with the necessity of total destruction, but the refugees who'd come from other purged worlds confirmed the pattern, said that evacuation followed by information lockdown followed by permanent relocation was the standard procedure when Exterminatus was declared, when the Imperium decided that salvation was more expensive than sterilization. The confirmation came not through official announcement but through absence, through the removal of our world's designation from the star charts that the camp's navigation displays showed, through the quiet update to administratum records that listed our origin planet as terminated per inquisitorial decree, through the arrival of new refugees from other worlds who were assigned to our section of the camp and who asked where we were from and who fell silent when we told them, and who looked at us with the mixture of horror and pity that people reserve for the marked, for those who've touched something that by all rights should have killed them. The Space Marines had called Exterminatus, had made the determination that our world couldn't be saved, and whatever weapons they'd used, cyclonic torpedoes or virus bombs or atmospheric incinerators, or some combination that doctrine prescribed for our particular category of contamination had been deployed, and the world where I'd been born, where I'd learned to walk in fields that stretched to every horizon, where I'd buried my grandfather and fallen in love for the first time with a girl whose name I still remember, even though she didn't survive the transit to the refugee station. That world was gone, was reduced to a dead sphere circling its star, was a cautionary tale that imperial preachers would reference in sermons about the price of insufficient vigilance. The psychological damage manifested slowly, spreading through the refugee population in waves that the camp's minimal medical staff couldn't treat because they lacked both resources and expertise for trauma on this scale, and people began to break in ways that were subtle at first: difficulty sleeping, changes in appetite, withdrawal from social interaction, but that escalated into more serious symptoms as months became years, and the hope of permanent relocation faded into the acceptance that the camp was our permanent condition, that we would spend the rest of our lives in this converted manufactorum, waiting for assignments that would never come because the administratum had essentially forgotten about us, had filed us away in whatever category they used for populations that were too contaminated to integrate, but not contaminated enough to require immediate execution. Some people developed elaborate delusions, convinced themselves that the evacuation had been the contamination, that our world still existed and that we'd been kidnapped by hostile forces, and that rescue was imminent if we could just hold out long enough. Others went the opposite direction, embraced a nihilism that expressed itself through deliberate self-harm or through the kind of listless surrender that eventually resulted in death from the simple refusal to continue eating or drinking or caring whether they lived or died. The camp administrators responded to the crisis with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to every problem, increasing security to prevent suicide attempts, implementing mandatory psychological screening that identified the most severe cases for quarantine in a separate facility that we never saw and that people sent there never returned from. I survived through a combination of dissociation and routine, through training myself not to think about what I'd lost and instead focusing on the immediate tasks that filled each day, attending the mandatory prayer sessions where we thanked the Emperor for our deliverance even as we mourned our damnation, standing in the ration lines where we received our daily allotment of nutrient paste that tasted like nothing and satisfied nothing but that kept us alive, participating in the make-work programs that the administrators instituted to prevent idleness, sorting scrap metal or cleaning already clean corridors or performing other tasks that served no purpose beyond occupying our time and maintaining the fiction that we were productive citizens rather than warehoused liabilities. I stopped using my name, internalized the numerical designation that the processing clerk had assigned me, became the numbers and letters that the system recognized rather than the person those numbers and letters were supposed to represent, and the transition was easier than it should have been, required less effort than maintaining an identity that had no context, no home, no connection to any life that continued to exist. My parents died within a year of each other, my father from some respiratory infection that the camp's medical bay couldn't treat, and my mother from the heartbreak that Imperial doctrine insisted wasn't a real medical condition but that killed anyway, and I attended their cremations and scattered their ashes in the camp's designated disposal area and felt nothing, not grief or loss or even relief that their suffering had ended, just the blank acceptance that death was a thing that happened and that happened to everyone eventually and that had happened to them. The camp received new refugees periodically, waves of displaced people from other worlds that had failed the Imperium standards for continued existence, and we could always tell which ones were from Exterminatus worlds because they had the same look we'd had, the same shell-shocked disbelief that gradually hardened into bitter acceptance, and sometimes we'd share stories with them, compare the circumstances that had led to our respective worlds' annihilation, and the stories varied in details but shared common themes. Corruption discovered too late, contamination spread too far, Imperial response arriving not as salvation but as execution. There were refugees from a hive world where a genestealer cult had infiltrated the administratum, from an agri world where the crops themselves had become infectious vectors for something that converted human tissue into new plant matter, from a shrine world where the very devotion of the pilgrims had attracted attention from things that fed on faith, and all of us had experienced the same trajectory: investigation, evacuation, obliteration. The Space Marines had made the call in every case, had determined that the contamination exceeded the threshold where conventional purging was sufficient, had requested inquisitorial approval for Exterminatus, and received it because the criteria for approval were designed to err on the side of overkill, because the Imperium's first principle was survival through any means, and if survival required destroying 10 worlds to ensure that 11 remained pure, then that was simply the mathematics of empire. I met a woman in the camp who'd been an Arbeits officer on her world before the purge, who'd been part of the investigation that uncovered the corruption, and she told me that the decision to call Exterminatus wasn't made by the Space Marines alone, but rather was the culmination of a process that involved multiple agencies and layers of authority, that the Space Marines were actually the last, rather than the first link, in a chain that began with local Arbeits and administratum officials, noticing anomalies and reporting them through proper channels and requesting support and receiving support in the form of specialists who conducted assessments and wrote reports and made recommendations that traveled up through the bureaucratic hierarchy until finally reaching someone with the authority to authorize total destruction. She said the process could take months or years depending on the severity and how quickly the reports moved through the system, and that the Space Marines were deployed only when the contamination had reached a point where conventional military response was insufficient, where the threat required the kinds of weapons and tactics that only the Emperor's finest warriors could deploy. She said this as if it was supposed to be comforting, as if the knowledge that our world's destruction had been thoroughly documented and properly authorized should somehow make the loss more bearable, and I wondered what kind of mind could find solace in bureaucratic correctness when the outcome was planetary genocide, what kind of conditioning the Arbeits training provided that allowed her to maintain faith in the system, even after the system had destroyed her entire world. The dreams started 5 years after the evacuation, nightmares that were too coherent to be random neural activity, that felt less like products of my own subconscious and more like transmissions from external sources, and in the dreams I was back on my world, but the world was wrong, was transformed, the fields growing things that weren't plants, the settlements inhabited by things that wore human shapes, but that moved and spoke and thought in ways that revealed their fundamental inhumanity. I would walk through this corrupted landscape, feeling simultaneously terrified and fascinated, repulsed by what I saw but unable to look away, and sometimes I would encounter people I'd known, neighbors and friends and family members, who would greet me with smiles that showed too many teeth, and who would try to explain to me why the transformation was actually an improvement, why surrendering to the corruption was liberation rather than damnation, why the Emperor's Imperium was the real prison, and what had happened to our world was actually escape. I would wake from these dreams with my heart pounding and my skin cold with sweat, and I would lie on my sleeping mat in the camp's darkness, listening to the breathing of thousands of other refugees, and wondering if they were having the same dreams, if whatever had corrupted our world had somehow followed us into evacuation, had embedded itself not in our bodies but in our minds where no amount of physical quarantine could contain it. The camp's chaplain, an old man who'd served in the position for decades and who'd presumably heard every variation of refugee trauma, listened to my description of the dreams with an expression that started as professional sympathy and gradually shifted to something closer to alarm, and when I finished speaking, he was silent for a long time, and finally he asked me if I'd shared these dreams with anyone else, and when I said no, he told me that I should continue not sharing them, that some forms of contamination were mimetic rather than physical, that could spread through communication rather than contact, and that by describing the dreams to him, I'd potentially infected him with whatever spiritual poison they represented. He prescribed prayer and penance, gave me specific litanies to recite before sleep that were supposed to ward against unwanted psychic influence, told me to report to him immediately if the dreams persisted or intensified, and I followed his instructions, but the dreams continued, and I stopped reporting them because I understood that admission of continued symptoms would eventually result in my being sent to whatever facility housed the cases that were too contaminated to remain even in refugee camps, and I'd heard enough about those facilities from other refugees to know that they were places you didn't come back from, that they were warehouses for the slowly dying, that the Imperium's mercy toward the spiritually compromised consisted of isolation and neglect rather than active execution, but that the outcome was the same. The realization that the Exterminatus had been necessary came gradually rather than as sudden revelation, assembled from pieces of understanding that accumulated over years of processing what I'd seen and heard and experienced. And the realization was this: our world had been dying long before the Space Marines arrived, had been compromised so thoroughly that everyone on it was already lost, was already transforming into something that couldn't be permitted to exist, and the evacuation hadn't been mercy but rather quarantine, hadn't been saving us but rather separating us from the healthy populations we might contaminate, and the refugee camps weren't temporary housing but permanent isolation, and we weren't survivors but rather infection vectors that the Imperium was too merciful or too bureaucratic to simply execute, but that couldn't be allowed to rejoin normal Imperial society. The Space Marines hadn't destroyed our world to save the Imperium, they'd destroyed it to save us, or at least to save what remained of our souls, because whatever was growing in our world's soil and manifesting in our dreams and transforming Preacher Voss in that chapel was something that consumed identity, that erased the self and replaced it with something else, and by destroying the world they'd interrupted that process, had prevented us from completing the transformation, even though they couldn't reverse the damage already done. I understood this, and I hated them for it, hated the Space Marines and the Inquisition and the Imperium they served, hated them not because they'd made the wrong choice, but because they'd made the only possible choice, because the alternative to Exterminatus wasn't salvation, but something worse than death, was existence as puppets, piloted by forces that wore our faces and spoke with our voices, but that had consumed everything that made us us and replaced it with themselves. I hated them because they were right, and because being right meant that my world had to die, meant that billions of people had to die, meant that every person I'd ever known had been either obliterated in the purge or was now residing in camps like this one, warehoused and waiting to die because we were contaminated beyond recovery, but not contaminated enough to require immediate execution. I hated them because the system they enforced was both monstrous and necessary, was both cruel and merciful, was both everything wrong with the Imperium and everything that allowed the Imperium to survive, and I hated them because understanding all this didn't make it hurt any less, didn't make the loss any more bearable, didn't provide any comfort beyond the cold knowledge that our suffering had been calculated and deemed acceptable by intelligences vast and ancient, and completely indifferent to anything as trivial as individual human happiness. The camp still stands, or at least I assume it does because I'm still here, still alive after 23 years of refugee status, still attending the prayer sessions and standing in the ration lines and performing the make-work tasks that justify my continued existence. And the camp has become the only reality I know, the only context in which I can conceive of myself, and the world I came from has taken on the quality of dream or story, something that happened to someone else, someone who shared my memories but who wasn't really me. New refugees continue to arrive, displaced populations from newly purged worlds, and I see in their faces the same progression I experienced, the same journey from shocked disbelief to bitter acceptance to numb endurance, and sometimes I try to help them, try to ease their transition by sharing what I've learned about how to survive here, about how to stop being who you were and become what the system needs you to be, about how to let go of identity and embrace designation, about how to live without hope, because hope is a resource that the camps can't provide, and that maintaining it costs more energy than you can afford to spend. Most of them don't listen, aren't ready to hear what I'm telling them. need to complete their own journey before they can accept the lessons that journey teaches. But occasionally someone understands, someone makes the transition faster than average, and I recognize in their eyes the same cold comprehension I eventually achieved, the same understanding that this is permanent, that we are the living dead, that the Exterminatus destroyed our worlds but saved our souls, and that this camp is not prison but purgatory, not punishment but protection, not cruelty but the only kindness the Imperium can afford to show to those who've touched corruption and survived. This is what happens when Space Marines call Exterminatus. This is what the pronouncement means for those who survive the purge. This is the fate that awaits populations deemed too contaminated to save but too human to simply execute. We are evacuated and isolated and warehoused and forgotten. We are numbers in databases and lines on logistics reports and problems deferred rather than solved. We are evidence of the Imperium's mercy and simultaneously proof of its cruelty. We are the living testament to the doctrine that survival requires sacrifice, and that some sacrifices are measured not in deaths, but in lives lived in permanent exile from everything that made those lives meaningful. The Space Marines made the right choice, made the only choice, and I hate them for it, and I thank the Emperor for them, and I pray every day that no one else has to understand what I understand, has to accept what I've accepted, has to live knowing that their entire world was destroyed by the very forces meant to protect it, knowing that the destruction was necessary, knowing that if they'd remained on that world they would have become something that needed to be destroyed, and knowing that the refugee camp where they'll spend the rest of their lives is both prison and sanctuary, both damnation and salvation, both the Imperium's greatest failure and its most necessary function.